I'm going to try getting this lecture on remote desktop because my Mac dongle that connects to the VG doesn't work too well right now because it's not here. So, this is lecture 3. It's basically going to be a bunch of slides, and then the next time I'm going to get into everything in more detail. So the first thing I wanted to do before I even start, before the remote desktop connection dies out on me, is show a few things I couldn't get to last time. So if you remember, I was talking about control panels. Well, one of them is Solus, which is basically for virtual private servers or VPS servers. And this is what that control panel looks like. So it gives you your disk space that you're allotted and how much you're using, how much bandwidth you're using. Remember that bandwidth isn't an infinite resource. So I get 500 gigabytes of bandwidth. If I go over that, the company charges me $2 per gigabyte. So just thought I'd let you know, you need to reboot your server, you can reinstall the operating system, and do all sorts of cool stuff with this panel. And the other thing I wanted to get to before this dies is PHP Designer. So this is what PHP Designer looks like. It basically neatly highlights your code so that you can tell what it's doing. And once again, this isn't free, but it's my favorite editor. And I went through and I completely did a mock-up of famousgo.com, except for I did a mock-up in HTML, which has no PHP integrated into it, so hopefully you can understand what it's doing. I made sure it indented the code properly so that you can see where parts of the code work, and that's basically all I wanted to cover besides what I did last time. So that's up on the website, you can go to it and you can download the code. And you can see the Photoshop file itself. I also uploaded the build that's current for Famous Pill. I always make builds, or I number them, so that when I modify my website template, I can always keep track of what my website might have looked like way back, whenever it was. So I'm on build 11, planning on going to build 12 within the next couple of months when I get time to do so. So with that said, just thought I'd put that out there that it's up on the website, and now I no longer need remote desktop. So that's good, I guess. So this is lecture 3, mostly PHP. It's a bunch of slides. After I get through the slides, that's when I'm going to start playing around with demos, which will be the last lecture. And I'll get into WordPress. I'll move the theme I created in HTML to WordPress so that you'll get a feel for how to create a WordPress blog that works. And I recently found out that WordPress has a built-in gallery, so I will actually talk about that instead of Picasa, which was a plugin that we were creating with a friend of mine. So other than that, the overview basically already covered it, but we're going to do a little bit of URL rewriting. At least I'll give you some resources so that you can figure out how to do it. And I'll introduce MySQL, some vulnerabilities that are very common in code ran by newcomers, and some security with PHP. I'll also make a simple contact form that works, and I might get to the content management system, but I'm really probably going to push that off to the next lecture, just because of the time constraint. So, getting right into the material, PHP is a pre-hypertext processor. For the most part, it's easily used, easily integrated into Microsoft's Internet Server, Apache, Late HTTP. All the servers I can think of include PHP. It's also open source, so it's free to use, and it's very popular right now. It's a general purpose scripting language, and it's well suited for web development. PHP generally goes with web development. And finally, it's easily embeddable into HTML. It runs on the server, so if you want to make your page look blingy and everything, you're going to have to use some client-side JavaScript. I'm not a fan of JavaScript, but it is very useful for making web pages look nice. Facebook uses a lot of it. So I would recommend getting into JavaScript unlike I did. The advantages to PHP, well, the advantage that comes to me is it includes everything, including the kitchen sink. It's hard to find something that PHP doesn't include. So if you want to do regular expressions or do some weird stuff for you, it probably includes that functionality, and the documentation is at php.net. You can also call other PHP scripts from your main page, which is what WordPress kind of does, so that you can split up all your coding so that things can go into files that are named appropriately so that you can have a mess of files, but everything can kind of fit into the whole picture of your website, so you don't end up making single files for your home page, about page, whatever, and rewrite a lot of code. It allows you to include stuff so that you can reuse everything. So, and finally, PHP is very efficient if the programmer knows how to make it efficient. Unfortunately, most users don't make it efficient. So it's very tricky to create efficient code that when you don't know how to code properly in the first place. So good coding techniques are very important when you're writing PHP. And I've had friends who went through the first version of this web lecture, got accounts on my server, and they made these web pages that were horrendously inefficient, and they almost crashed my web server because they didn't know what they were doing. And they were writing these really fancy MySQL queries and all sorts of stuff that was very inefficient, and I would never think about even writing it. But new programmers tend to learn from example. I know I did, so it's not a huge problem if you do, but the hosting company will probably get on your case if you end up writing something that's inefficient that affects the server. With that said, PHP tags, in the old days you could just do the bracket question mark. Not anymore. As of PHP 5.3, they took those out because they could be intermingled with ASP and other languages. So now we have to use bracket question mark PHP to open up PHP scripts, and we have to close with this. PHP statements are simply commands to PHP. Each statement is semicolon separated, like other languages, and essentially that's all you really need to know about statements. So here's your first program, Hello World, and it's the first program in every programming language I've ever come up against. So echo space quote hello world, or whatever you want inside of the quotes, and the quote mark and semicolon, and that will print out hello world to the page. And in the first lecture, I quickly did that. So hello world in PHP with HTML, just slap a couple of div tags around it, and all works great. Now, that backslash quote is actually an escape character. Is that the next slide? Nope. I'll do this first, I guess. So basically, we can also do echo for each line. So let's say that you want to keep PHP open for the duration of your script. You can actually echo out everything, including HTML, and it'll work the same way. You can open up PHP and close it many times within a script. So if you have a big file of code and then you have a big block of HTML, you can definitely do either the HTML without PHP echoing it, or you can do the HTML with PHP echoing it. I discovered there really isn't a big time difference between doing it this method and the other method, page load time, although having PHP have to echo out a bunch of stuff usually doesn't make a lot of sense. So if it's one line or two that you want to echo out inside of a bunch of code, then by all means have PHP do it. If you got a big block of HTML like the header part of it, let it go. So what the heck is this escape character? Well, in PHP, like most languages, we have a bunch of stuff that the operating system sees that may not be really great. So, for example, the quote character, if you're inside of a big, huge echo clause, is going to terminate the quote, and then PHP will expect a semicolon. So if we wanted to echo out a literal quote, rather, basically what we're going to do is put the / character in front of it, and that escapes the next character so that that will get gets printed out to the page literally. So you would have hello world in the previous example with two quotes around it when it's printed out to the page. So that's what that is, basically. Single versus double quotes, there's only one huge difference between the two, and that is single quotes will not allow you to put variables between them. So if you do quote, a single quote, then $hello, if hello happens to be a variable that maps to hello world, the single quote will make it to where $hello prints out literally. If you do a double quote, it'll print out the value of the variable. So if it's mapped to hello world, it'll print out hello world. The PHP info function is very useful if you need to know what the server has on it. So at this time, I want to see if PuTTY is installed on the system. Yep. And I want to show you what the PHP info function looks like. Okay, so I already have the file. It's basically PHP info like you said before. So now if I go to the website, not sure if I like Internet Explorer, but whatever, it works. Info.php will echo out this weird thing that tells you the PHP version, when it was built by the administrator of the server. It'll tell you lots of stuff about what PHP is doing, and you're always going to run into the problem of configuration files. There's always a global server configuration file, but if your admin set it up properly, which most do, other than the Buffalo ones, you can make your own php.ini file and put that into your own home directory, and that will automatically be loaded. And basically what php.ini is a file that tells PHP all of its configuration details. So if you need if PHP is having problems with memory and it needs more server memory, you can override your administrator's php.ini file and make PHP allow more memory from the server, thus making your script run. And scripts that require huge amounts of memory tend to be video processing scripts for sites like YouTube, if you have spin-offs of YouTube for whatever reason. And I've also seen photo galleries require that too. Typically, if you're using a pre-made script, it'll tell you if you need to modify the php.ini file. So moving on, PHP info creates a web page like we said, and it tells you if PHP is working. Permission note, 755 is typically the permission for most PHP files. On a server like mine where you're running SU-PHP, which runs PHP as a user, 644 is perfectly acceptable.